Day, Amanda McManus, Joe Arney, Steve Silva, Nyap Lee, and my biggest thanks to Annie Hergenroder, those of you who were yesterday at reception and thought that I'd forgotten about her. I did not, because Annie has been the real backbone of this conference. So thank you, Annie, for making organizing a conference so much fun and for always keeping a smile. And she's hiding behind the door there because she did not want me to say these things this morning. There are also more people I'd like to thank, starting with my friend and the Associate Director of the Center for Media, Religion and Culture and Chair of Religious Studies, Debbie Whitehead, Nandi Pointer, who is the lead coordinator of our center and a PhD student in media studies, the administrative assistant of the center, Betsy Millay, who is handling things outside and has been wonderful with the organizing of this conference, the amazing senior faculty fellows of the center, Nathan Schneider and Samira Rajabi, and all the wonderful fellows of the center who are here this morning. And of course, to Stuart Hoover, the founding director of the Center of Media, Religion and Culture, and the reason we are able actually to hold these conferences. And as I said earlier, this is our 10th conference, and we're proud that we have been able to do this every other year. This conference is also possible because of the generous support of many departments and units on campus. And I'd like to thank the College of Media, Communication and Information, the Center for Asian Studies, the Departments of Media Studies, Communication, Religious Studies, Sociology, Political Science, History, Women and Gender Studies, and Ethnic Studies. But I want to start with a land acknowledgement. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. And I'll add that this is not a statement of property. Land is no property. Land is no territory. Land was meant to always be free. I've thought really hard about the significance of this acknowledgement in the context of what's happening in the world today, and also the theme of our conference. These words feel like a farce, an outrageous debris of a brutal colonial legacy, a petty performance of shame in the wake of a long-standing crime and one of the oldest thefts in history. Is this what remains after a genocide? A spectacle of words, masquerading as justice, guilt, and shame. The world is too cruel to expect symbols on a page to smooth over the ruthless roughness of empire, to close the cracks of the sins of injustice submerged by the unrelenting comfort of innocence and the privilege of ignorance. Can we still recite these words? Is this the thing that survives the catastrophe? Are we condemned to relive history as a fleeting gesture of a dull and ordinary acknowledgement? What is the point of our knowing? Is this it? Is this how we write and speak as witnesses? Is this the promised gift of our narration? Is this how the wounds of empire heal? Peace, shalom, salam, friends, colleagues, people, humans. I come to you this morning with a heavy heart. I come to you not as a scholar, educator, as an Arab, as an American, a Muslim born in North Africa. I come to you without a name, without a nationality, without a religion, without an origin, without titles, without the pedigree of publications, without the protocols of academic performance. I come to you as a fellow human with a lump in my throat. For how long are we going to play witness to the suffering of distant others? Aren't we all ashamed of a humanity that moves at the tempo of constant crisis and overwhelming catastrophe? Catastrophes instigated by toxic forms of nationalism, fueled by racism, nativism, religious extremism, greed, and anthropocentrism. Are the tears of a trembling orphan child worth nothing anymore? Is the wailing of a mother who lost 50 members of her family just a spectacle we scroll through on TikTok? Do the families of the kidnapped civilians not deserve to be reunited with their loved ones? What number of dead and maimed civilians, of destroyed homes, of scorched neighborhoods and cities will ever satiate this interminable vengeance? How much more loss and anguish can a human being endure for us to say, stop? Is a photo of an American former president signing, quote, for Israel on a bomb just normal now? Can I call out these crimes? Can I plead for ceasefire and hold love in my heart at the same time for Jewish people and for my Jewish friends who are here? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. And you bet I can. As the Ugandan political theorist Mahmoud Mamdani said earlier this week in an article in The Nation, quote, to conflate the critique of a state with the critique of a people poses a challenge to a democratic culture. The more states clothe their actions as those of a religious or cultural or racial identity, the closer we come to the end of democracy. We no longer have the possibility of a secular critique of a state, end of quote. How much freedom do I really have to say what I'm saying now without the fear of censorship, without the stick of intimidation whipping me back into silence? Do I have to ask for permission to narrate? Please tell me which office will accept my application to get a license that will set my speech free. I am angry and exhausted by this anger. Do not be fooled by the softness of my voice. These words were meant to be screamed. You see, I wish I could yell these words like the Moroccan poet of native Amazigh origin, Muhammad Khairuddin, who wrote poems, novels, and plays in the wake of independence from France. When speaking on television or performing his poems, Khairuddin shouted his words out loud. His signature concept was what he called linguistic guerrilla or seismic writing to define his aversion to rules and conventions. Khairuddin yelled everywhere, on stage and in conversations with French journalists and intellectuals, with Moroccan authorities, because the world, he said, around me was so desperate for screaming words dealing with an arrogantly deaf audience. He once said, quote, to restore life, which is action, you must know how to unearth the right words, to create the adequate formulas and forms, as well as new forces. You must reinvent a universe starting from diffuse, almost non-existent material, end of quote. My anger is not directed at you. My anger comes from the fact that we are increasingly deprived of having conversations of equals, where the burden is not on one side to prove they belong to the club of humanity. We live in an age where everyone seems to be talking, but very few of us are saying anything. We look for simplified and small answers to complex and big questions. Please imagine these words in the highest pitch a voice can ever deliver, because our chaotic and violent realities demand sounds, words, knowledge, research, lessons, rhythms, forms, conversations, impulses, aesthetics, and poetics that match the harshness and vulgarity we are living with. This is not an eloquent speech. Like Frantz Fanon, the champion of the wretched of the earth, I do not want my words to be beautiful. I want my language to be harsh. It's not relief I seek. It's that discomfort of pain that is unresolved by the escapism of empathy that I hope to make linger for all of us. When does a conference cross into that unsettling space beyond the ordinary talk, beyond the proper and proposed, beyond the compulsion to move on? When do we stop issuing meek statements of solidarity, indignation, support, repulsion, and start sharpening our words and experimenting with new forms, new practices of assembly, and new ways of talking among ourselves? What sounds or sound do we want this conference to emit into the world? Which leads me to the title of this conference, Fire on the Mountain, and the idea of glitching our encounter. Given its topic and the urgency of its themes globally, the idea behind this event was to ask ourselves, what does it mean to hold a conference in the wake of catastrophe? COVID, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the war in Yemen, the conflicts in the Sudan, climate crisis, migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, deep political polarization, the rise of xenophobic and neo-fascist political parties to power, anti-Black violence, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, a disturbing nostalgia for walls and borders, and imagined histories of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. What is the point of an encounter like ours? Why are we meeting? Do we just diagnose the disease? Do we simply list and record the inventory of violence, anguish, and injustice? Do we just open up the wounds, parade the pain of others, cry fire on the mountains, and drink and mingle and move on? As Gloria Anzaldúa reminds us, quote, history still pinches like an outgrown shoe. And perhaps, despite our writing, our publishing, our conferencing, our listing, and our recording, what do we want from this conference? What do we want from us? Are conferences just rituals, tools we repeat year in and year out? We had big plans for this conference, big plans for this conference, but I have to admit, we were distracted by the bonds and sticks of empire, by the overwhelming terror of it all. It matters how we meet, why we hold conferences, and more importantly, it matters what we do in these meetings and what energies we leave with together. It matters that we can trouble the conference instead of being troubled by it and by how overwhelming everything seems, that we refuse its lulls of satisfying our intellectual curiosity. What else can a conference do? Yes, I come to you this morning with lots of questions and unfortunately not many answers, but I look to you all to hopefully find oxygen in a world hard of breathing. So please honor this plea at the end of our call for abstracts, that fire on the mountain is not a pretty slogan, but an honest invitation to go off script together. Take this plea to heart in the next few days. We have an amazing lineup of speakers and panelists who will help us both take stock of the inventory and think for us and with us about a roadmap of possibility. So in the spirit of a warning, both here and looming in the horizon, I begin this conference with a departure from ceremony, and I hope our first speaker will forgive me. We invited Phil Gorski, Rakashon, Ramesh Srinivasan, and Raylan Rabaka, not because of their titles, the number of publications on their CV, the accomplishments, or the fame of their institutions. We called on them because in spending time with them over the past year, we found depth, lucidity, provocation, innovation, and a deep sense of warning and hope. The moment is too heavy for proper introduction. Our speaker this morning is Phil Gorski, a leading sociologist of religion, who has an important warning about white Christian nationalism and its growing threat to American democracy. And I just want that to be the introduction, because the moment is very heavy. Phil, I hope you don't mind that I'm introducing you this way. This is not meant to undercut your long expertise and your deeply insightful scholarships on topics such as state formation, nationalism, revolution, secularization, civil religion, and the interaction of religion and politics. Our audience will know exactly why we invited you once they have heard from you today. You have authored many publications on the themes of this conference, and I'm extremely pleased that you accepted our invitation. We are grateful for your presence with us today. And perhaps my small insurrection here is insignificant, but I hope it stands as a gesture to suspend the protocols of everyday or the everyday to allow us to address the heaviness and breathlessness of our times. We have been living on the brink of disaster, and some of us have been living on the brink of disaster for a long time. And now an all-out war that could wipe out millions of innocent people. We cannot meet this moment with the usual, oh, the buttons will be buttoned up again, and move on. So I leave you with this persistent question that I hope will stay with you for the rest of the Fire on the Mountain conference. Okay. I guess that just provided the soundtrack for the question. And the question is, what are you here for today? Please help me welcome Dr. Phil Gorski.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so I imagine that you've all seen photos like this, photos of Trump's failed coup attempt just over 3 years ago. And for those of you who are scholars of religion, I imagine you also took note of various symbols on display: Christian flags and Jesus Saves banners, Confederate flags, and wooden gallows, lots and lots of Trump flags too. So many progressive observers were puzzled by this juxtaposition of symbols. They saw apples and oranges, symbols of religion and nationalism, racism and vigilantism, libertarianism and authoritarianism. What Sam Perry and I saw was a fruit cocktail, which we call white Christian nationalism. My talk today is based on our 2022 book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism, a Threat to American Democracy. In it, we address what, when, who, how, and where. I'll offer 3 definitions of white Christian nationalism. I'll talk about who embraces and propagates it, both historically and today. I'll talk about when it first emerged and how it's changed over time. Then I'll talk about how it works rhetorically and politically today. And finally, I'll talk about where it's headed and why it's become a mortal threat to American democracy. So, what is white Christian nationalism? One way of thinking about it is as a political vision, or in social science jargon, a set of attitudes and preferences about politics and policy. That's how my co-author Sam Perry thinks about it. He's a survey researcher, and he's constructed a scale that he uses to measure Christian nationalism and assesses its effects. It's based on a series of questions that have been asked in several surveys over time. And here are those questions to give you a flavor. In a study released last year, Robert P. Jones of the Public Religions Research Institute constructed a similar scale using a somewhat more targeted set of questions. And this allows us to answer questions such as how many Christian nationalists are there and who they are. Now, in an earlier book with Andrew Whitehead, Perry divided survey respondents into 4 categories based on their scores on the scale. They found that almost half of Americans partly or strongly affirm Christian nationalism, though Jones's estimate is a little bit lower, around 30%. Now, you might wonder, and I'm often asked, whether white Christian nationalism is just another way of saying conservative white evangelical. Short answer to this question is no. Here is Jones's breakdown by religious traditions. As you'll see, not all conservative white evangelicals are white Christian nationalists, and many non-whites and non-evangelicals are. Here is a similar breakdown by Whitehead and Parrott. I invite you to dig into these and their publications, but I'll just give you the key takeaway right now. Christian nationalism and white evangelicalism overlap a great deal, but they are not the same. In fact, some of the most outspoken critics of white Christian nationalism today are themselves conservative white evangelicals. I'm thinking of people like Tim Alberta, David French, Beth Moore, Russell Moore, and Peter Wenner. One could also add the faculty of Wheaton College to this list. I originally hail from Wheaton, Illinois. They released a statement condemning the J6 Christian nationalism, white supremacism in no uncertain terms. So just what do Christian nationalists believe? Well, obviously they believe that America is a Christian nation, or at least it was, and it should be again. That's really the defining characteristic of white Christian nationalism, as Perry and I understand it. But what else? Well, if they are white Christian nationalists, they also believe in strong military. They support the police, they want law and order, but they oppose gun control and mask wearing and government regulations. They're pro-life, but also pro-death penalty. It goes without saying that they're against government handouts, even for kids, and for free market capital. There's not really any surprises here, right? That's basically the Republican Party platform today, insofar as it has one beyond mere loyalty to Trump. So it is surprising if you step back for just a moment. After all, what does any of this have to do with Christianity, right? And that's not the only puzzle here. Ask a white Christian nationalist if they're racist, and you will definitely get an earful. Like most white Americans, they will insist that they are not biased or prejudiced. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence tells a different story, because Christian nationalism is strongly statistically associated with various indicators of racial animus. Amongst other things, it's correlated with opposition to interracial marriage and adoption, and with support for strong borders and immigration restrictions. It is also positively correlated with a strong sense of white grievance, as well as with anti-Black animus. It's a strong claim, I know, but I can show you a receipt here. If you take a look at these graphs, they chart the relationship between the degree of Christian nationalism and beliefs about discrimination amongst Black and white Americans. As you notice, Christian nationalism has absolutely no effect on beliefs amongst Blacks. The line is flat. But there is a highly linear relationship amongst whites. White Christian nationalists believe that Blacks face very little discrimination and that whites face a lot of discrimination. And the higher their score on the Christian nationalism scale, the more strongly they believe these things. That is why Perry and I talk about white Christian nationalism. Now, where do people get such ideas? You might ask yourself. From many different sources. Crack open the history and civics textbooks used by many Christian academies and Christian homeschoolers, and you'll find it right there in black and white. Or you can turn into the sermons of well-known Christian nationalist pastors like Robert Jeffries or Greg Locke. You can download some tunes by Christian nationalist musicians like Sean Foyt. Maybe you're not much of a churchgoer though. No worries, just grab tickets to the Reawaken America extravaganza, headlined by Michael Flynn, Trump's disgraced national security advisor. If you're lucky, my pillow guy, Mike Lindell, might make a cameo. If you prefer something just a tad more highbrow, then you could check out a speech by Christian Cuba historian David Barton. If he's not going to be speaking in your area, though, then just navigate to wallbuilders.com and order some of his books or videos. There's lots of merch available on the website. If you'd like to be more, if you're more interested in getting politically involved, though, you can sign up with Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition. They're all in on Trump these days and on Christian nationalism, which I guess is because that's where the money is. Now, these examples hopefully make clear white Christian nationalism is not just an ideology. It's a movement, or rather an ideology that connects a variety of movements and is propagated by various cultural entrepreneurs. Some of the movements are primarily religious, others primarily political, but all of them mix conservative religion and reactionary politics. And the influence of the ideology extends well beyond the boundaries of these organizations, and indeed beyond the bounds of the conservative Christian subculture. For paradoxical as it may sound, white Christian nationalism is an increasingly secular movement. Christian nationalism overlaps with the religious right, but it's not identical with it. Nor, this is the key point, did Christian nationalism originate with the Christian right. The deep story of Christian nationalism is an old story, a much older story, and it's not really just one story, it's three stories in one. Three stories taken from scripture and then woven together into a political ideology. Harry and I call them the Promised Land story. Right, but a little behind on my slides here. We call them the Promised Land story, the End Time story, and the Racial Curse story. Now, the Promised Land story, which in a way Nabil alluded to in his fiery introduction, the New England Puritans imagined themselves as New Israel, quite literally. At first, they cast Old England in this role, but over time, they came to see the New World as their true promised land. And they also came to see the native peoples as their enemies. Canaanites or Amalekites were occupying their land, people who had to be driven out or destroyed so that they could claim their rightful inheritance. Now, in the end time story, the Puritans' wars with the Native Americans were recast as cosmic struggles between the forces of good and evil. The denouement of the eschatological drama, in which God's new chosen people confronts hordes of, quite literally, demonic others. In the Racial Curse story, finally, Noah places a curse on one of his three sons, Ham. Ham's descendants bear a mark on their body. They are destined for servitude. And where do Ham's descendants settle down after the Great Flood? Why? In Africa, of course, which is why Africans are Black and why it's God's will that they should be enslaved. By 1690, the three key ingredients of white Christian nationalism were ready to be mixed together by Protestant theologians. And New England Puritan historian Cotton Mather was one of the first to serve up the original recipe of this fruit cocktail. Indeed, his ecclesiastical history of New England really remains the urtext of white Christian nationalism, the original recipe, if you will. Now, white Christian nationalism has, of course, evolved over the centuries, and in the Flag and the Cross, Carrie and I distinguish 5 phases in its development. I'm not going to go over all of them here. I'm just going to highlight some of the ways that the 5th phase, white Judeo-Christian nationalism, aka American exceptionalism, differs from earlier phases. And then I'll suggest that we may be witnessing the emergence of a 6th phase today. The 5th phase begins after World War II. Different from previous phases in at least 5 significant ways. First, whiteness was defined more expansively. The Irish and Italians now became fully white, though sort of did the Jews. Second, Blackness was invoked much more discreetly by the 1970s, with dog whistles rather than bullhorns, with political innuendo rather than racial epithets. Third, Protestant Christianity gave way to Judeo-Christian tradition. Catholics could now be real Americans, so could Jews in the tri-faith America in the 1950s and 1960s. Fourth, America was now defined in national rather than imperial terms. America still had an empire, of course, though it was cleverly hidden, as historian Daniel Immerwahr has shown. Fifth and finally, the loudest advocates of white Christian nationalism were now conservative evangelical. For most of American history, and this is an important point, the old mainline Protestant denominations have played this role. Some of the older folks in the room might still remember the old saw about the Episcopal Church being the Republican Party of prayer. The elder Bush, George H.W., was one of the last representatives of this lost belief. I've said a bit about when white Christian nationalism took shape and how it has evolved over time, but it's also waxed and waned. Looking back through American history, I would point to four catalysts of white Christian nationalism: wars against religio-cultural others, periods of mass immigration, times of economic turbulence, and movements against Black empowerment. For those of you out there who are keeping track, check, and check. It's not surprising that we are experiencing a powerful resurgence of white Christian nationalism today. So much for the when question. The answer there is 1690, not 1960. Now for the how. As in, how does white Christian nationalism work in contemporary politics? The short answer is in concert with white Christian individualism. Like white Christian nationalism, white Christian individualism emerged long ago and has evolved over time. The Puritan warrior is an early example. He built a city on a hill and burned native settlements. Later examples include the benevolent Christian slaveholder who ruled with a mixture of piety and brutality, or the Christian homesteader who settled the frontier and slaughtered the buffalo, or the Cold War evangelical who battled God's communism abroad and supported McCarthyism at home. All were prepared to use violence to defend their liberty and oppose their understanding of law and order. The contemporary version of white Christian individualism is what my fellow sociologist Gerardo Martin has called Christian libertarianism. It emerged during the middle decades of the 20th century and is now better known by its colloquial nickname, personal accountability. It presumes that one's lot in life is a result of one's personal choices and only of those choices. Historical and social contexts are completely irrelevant to one's lot in life. Wealth or poverty, salvation or damnation, bliss or despair, it's all up to you and it's all on you, because you will also be held to account for your choices, whether by the market or by God, though it's sometimes hard to tell one invisible hand from the other. At least for Christian libertarian. Now, white Christian nationalism and white Christian individualism work in concert. They're really like two sides of the same coin. One is the flip side of the other. When white Christian men make claims on other Americans, they do so in the name of national unity and solidarity. But when racial and religious others make claims on white Christian men, they are refused in the name of individual rights, property rights, and personal ability. In other words, heads we win, tails everyone else loses. In this, you could see white Christian nationalism as a local manifestation of Will Hoyt's law, to wit, reactionary politics consists of exactly one proposition: there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. Let's take a quick look at contemporary politics to see this law in action. Let's start with the Tea Party. Remember that? It seems so long ago, doesn't it? Anyway, it all started on February 19, 2009, roughly 1 month after the inauguration of America's first Black president. Rick Santelli, a financial reporter with CNBC, delivered a viral rant from the trading floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, in which he blamed the 2008 financial crisis on losers who had taken out mortgages they couldn't afford, and then excoriated President Obama for bailing them out. He called for the formation of a new Tea Party, taxed enough already, to resist federal taxation and defend individual rights. So first blush, this sounds kind of secular and libertarian, right? But here's the thing. As academics and journalists began researching the Tea Party supporters and organizations, they made a couple of important discoveries. Most Tea Party supporters turned out to be older white evangelical men. Men who were also generally supportive of the idea that America is a Christian nation. Also, well-known evangelical political activists were centrally involved in the movement from the get-go. Indeed, Ralph Reed originally founded his Faith and Freedom Coalition to support the Tea Party. More, religion was also race. Tea Partiers were generally opposed to non-white immigration. Some Tea Party groups even emerged out of white vigilante groups. In short, the Tea Party was shot through with white Christian nationalism. Now let's shift our focus forward to the MAGAverse. In his 2017 inaugural address on American Carnage, President Trump promised that the American people would take back their country. They would band together around Christianity, which I guess means they would start winning again and saying Merry Christmas again. And bring Christianity back because it's a good thing. It would also put America first, restore law and order, build a great wall around the nation to keep out criminals and illegals. Oh, and institute a total ban on Muslims. That sure sounds a lot like white Christian nationalism, doesn't it? Indeed, I would argue that one way of understanding Trumpism, not the only way, but one way, is as a reactionary and secularized version of white Christian nationalism. Reactionary in the sense it abandons the polite rhetoric of American exceptionalism in favor of explicitly racist language about blood and violence. Poison the blood, I am your retribution. And secularized in the sense that apocalypticism gives way to mere catastrophizing. You won't have a country. Good and evil are replaced by friend and foe, kind of like Carl Schmitt for the masses, if you will. But just as the Tea Party's libertarian facade hid white Christian nationalism, so too does Trumpism resonate with what Perry and I call the holy trinity of white Christian individualism, namely freedom, order, and violence. First, violence. We all know that Trump is a master of verbal violence. He uses words as weapons to wound his opponents and intimidate his rivals. Look at Hillary, Sleepy Joe, Lying Ted, Marco, Low Energy Jeb, Meatball Ron. I'm sure yet further epithets are in the works. Of course, Trump is not above threatening or inciting physical violence. He did so on the campaign trail in 2016 and 2020, and of course, again on January 6th, and now in his 2024 campaign. What about freedom? When criticized for his intemperate speech, the insults, the threats, the profanity, Trump and his supporters style themselves as defenders of free speech, opponents of cancel culture, who dare to be politically incorrect. In other words, they claim the God-given right to use racist and sexist language with impunity, as in the good old days of Jim Crow and Mad Men. Finally, order, by which I mean racial order and gender order. Trump's response to BLM was to call for law and order, which is to say, like male violence, police violence, vigilante violence, even military violence if he had his way. After all, he sent in federal agents to Portland and Seattle, and would have sent in the military if advisors had not stopped him from invoking the Insurrection Act, something he promises to do on day one of the second term. Meanwhile, his response to white male violence in Charlottesville and Washington was unrepentant words about very fine people and patriotic Americans. He now opens his rallies with the so-called J6 chorus, a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner by incarcerated J6 protesters currently housed in the DC jail, with Trump's voiceover of the Pledge of Allegiance. Let me conclude with some thoughts about the recent past and the near future, about where we're coming from and where we might be headed. The Republican coalition that elected Ronald Reagan is often described as a three-legged stool. The three legs are neoconservative foreign policy hawks, pro-business market neoliberals, and socially conservative religious traditionalists. Note that this description is incomplete. The stool also had a concealed fourth leg. It was a chair, not a stool. Anti-Black racism. Now, the chair was always rickety. Like any political coalition, it was cobbled together out of a number of mismatched pieces. Free market capitalism doesn't really go together with family values, for example, nor does classical liberalism comport well with anti-Black racism, nor do a hawkish foreign policy and small government conservatism make for a good match. Over the last 2 decades, the Reagan coalition has come under increasing strain. The costs of the Second Iraq War in both blood and treasure soured much of the Republican base on American intervention. Then the 2008 financial crisis undermined popular faith in free markets and neoliberalism. The election of America's first Black president that same year stoked white racial grievance. So when Donald Trump rode down the golden escalator and plopped down on Reagan's chair, it shattered to pieces. Trump and his followers are now busily trying to reassemble the pieces into a golden throne. We are in the middle of what political scientists call an electoral realignment. The outcome of that process is uncertain. Perhaps left and right will fall back into progressive populist camps. But perhaps the dividing line will be Democrats versus authoritarian, or some mix of the two. Let's remark is that we are also in the midst of a religious realignment. The once mighty ranks of liberal Protestantism grow smaller and grayer by the year. Meanwhile, the ranks of the so-called nuns continue to expand. Indeed, the religion of no religion now counts around a quarter of the American population, more amongst younger age cohorts. About the same number who still call themselves evangelicals. Let me put this into historical perspective so you see what a radical change this really is. At the time of the American Revolution, fully 99% of the citizenry were white Protestants. That number first sank below 50% around 2013, just a decade ago. Today, the percentage of white Christians of any persuasion is in the low 40s. What about non-Christian religions? In fact, they only account for a very small percentage of the population. Less than 1% are Muslims, for example. But of course, they loom much larger in the conservative imagination. Is it really any wonder that conservative white Christians are gripped by moral and demographic panic? The result of that panic, however, is radicalization. White Christian nationalism also seems to be changing shape once again. We are perhaps beginning to see the emergence of a new form. Its new avant-garde is Pentecostals, particularly a network of radical Pentecostals known as the New Apostolic Reformation. These Pentecostal radicals differ from conservative evangelicals in a number of important ways. First, in terms of their understanding of the end time story. Most evangelicals were just passively waiting for the end times. But some Pentecostals want to force the end, believe they can force the end. On their view, Christians are commanded to, quote, seize dominion over the 7 mountains of social influence. That is, they must conquer the commanding heights in religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. Then, and only then, but precisely then, they believe, will Jesus return. Which is not to say that the battle between good and evil is not already going on. Pentecostals and other charismatics also believe that there is a constant battle between visible and invisible forces. Some view their religious and political enemies as literal instruments of Satan. They refer to this struggle as spiritual warfare. One example, on January 5th, 2021, a group of Pentecostals held a Jericho march in Washington, D.C. They marched around the Capitol, blowing the ceremonial ram's horns known as shofars. The goal? To drive away the demonic forces they believed had taken possession of the Capitol building itself and the Democratic congressional delegation inside. Many returned the next day as well to cheer on or participate in the failed insurrection. The line between spiritual warfare and physical violence is thin. On average, I should add, Pentecostals score much higher than evangelicals on the white Christian nationalism scale. The majority of Pentecostals explicitly reject the separation of church and state. The overwhelming majority believe that America should be officially declared a Christian nation, even if they also affirm that it's against the Constitution. In other words, these folks are not constitutional conservatives, they are theocratic radicals. The second change I want to highlight is somewhat paradoxical. At the same time that white Christian nationalism is becoming more radical, it is also becoming less Christian, and for two reasons. One is that evangelical, the word, is fast becoming a political label. How so, you might ask? Well, many self-identified evangelicals do not attend church. In fact, some do not even identify as Christian. For these people, evangelical simply equals conservative, equals MAGA. This shows up in the data in weird ways. For example, a surprising number of non-churchgoers and even some non-Christians now tell survey researchers that they are evangelical. Another reason is that many white supremacists are rebranding themselves as Christian nationalists. So here are a couple of recent books, including one by Andrew Torba, the notorious anti-Semite who founded Gab, the right-wing social media platform. He has an audience. This book debuted at number 12 on Amazon. Of course, white supremacists have been an important part of the conservative coalition since Nixon debuted his Southern Strategy in 1972, but they were more of a silent partner than a leading actor. No more. Here's another paradox for you. Even as the influence of white supremacist groups has grown, the centrality of whiteness might be declining. More and more Latino Americans have been converting to evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, and their politics tends to follow their religion, which is to say, to the right. But look at this roster, for example, of radical Pentecostal leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation, right? This is a pretty mixed bunch. So where is all this going? It's hard to say, but in principle, I see a couple of possible outcomes. One is that more and more Latinos reject the people of color label and come to understand themselves as white. The other is that white Christian nationalism sheds its anti-Blackness and becomes native Christian nationalism, or both. Contradictions in logic need not be contradictions in politics. There's one more shift that I want to highlight. Until fairly recently, white Christian nationalism tended to be triumphal in tone. The WASP belief that ran the country up until the 1960s tended to see themselves as conquerors, not victims. Theirs was the spirit of Julia Ward-Howe's battle hymn of the Republic. Our truth is marching on. The evangelicals that succeeded them were also optimists. They cheered when Reagan proclaimed Morning in America in his 1984 re-election campaign. No more. George W. Bush seemed to have sensed the vibe shift in real time. You can hear it in his off-the-cuff reaction to Trump's inaugural address on American carnage. That's some weird shit. Well, yes and no. Yes, if you're comparing it to the watered-down euphemisms of Reagan-esque American exceptionalism, but not at all if you turn the calendar back another half century to the full-throated white supremacist Christian nationalism of the 19th century. So there is one important difference. Earlier versions of Christian nationalism were not animated by grievance. nor were they led by would-be messiahs. And that too has changed. The Trump campaign recently disseminated a video entitled, quote, "God Made Trump." And some of his supporters evidently agreed. Somebody told the New York Times reporter, "I voted for Trump twice, and I'll vote for him again. He's the only savior I can see." So that's where we are. Where are we headed? One scenario is what social scientists call Ehrenvolk democracy, or master race democracy. That is, quote, a parliamentary regime in which the exercise of power and suffrage is restricted de facto and de jure to the dominant group, and in which that group understands itself as a superior race or culture, and subjects other races and cultures to varying degrees of legal repression and extra legal violence. In other words, Jim Crow 2.0. This, I think, is a likely path if the current Republican coalition regains control of the Senate and the White House in 2024 and manipulates voting in elections thereafter. As in Jim Crow 1.0, your rights will vary by race and region, and also by gender and religion. This is not the only possible scenario. There are at least two others. The first is just the bare survival of liberal democracy as we know it, which is to say the status quo ante the civil rights and voting rights laws of the mid-1960s. The second is the achievement of a multiracial democracy, which is to say a nation of nations and a people of people in which these rights are enforced and extended and historic injustices recognized and perhaps even undone. So what is to be done? When we speak of a multiracial democracy, I think our inclination as Americans is to imagine that the task is simply to put the multiracial in the democracy. But I think this is short-sighted. We need as well to focus on putting the democracy back in American democracy. The truth is that multiracial democracy is something which is difficult and which has only ever been briefly and imperfectly realized. The conservative form of existence, to quote Marx, for multiracial society is empire and autocracy, in which diversity is managed by a combination of autocratic leadership and coercive violence. What would putting the democracy in American democracy mean? It would not mean a series of short-term fixes. It would not mean winning one or even two election cycles. It would mean fundamental institutional transformation that would undo many of the veto points in counter-majoritarian institutions that prevent the realization of the popular will in today's America. This would involve things like expanding the Supreme Court and putting 15-year term limits on Supreme Court justices, abolishing the Electoral College, abolishing the filibuster, turning the Senate into something like the House of Lords, that is, an emasculated and weakened body which plays relatively little role in democracy. It would mean an end to gerrymandered racial districts, racially charged congressional districts, and so on and so forth. That is the sort of democracy that I dream of, and that is what it would take for America to finally be America, the land that still must be. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. There's one fire on the mountain for sure in that talk. Thank you so much. We have about half an hour for Q&A, and the floor is open for that. I will circulate this mic, whoever wants to start. Yes.
Hey, thank you. Terrific talk. are there defectors from this movement? You've mentioned some of the protagonists, but are there defectors who are public in the political sphere or arts and entertainment sphere that we should know about and pay attention to? And what are they saying?
So let me just preface this by saying that I think, politically speaking, in electoral terms, what is required right now is a popular front against autocratic takeover. And that is going to be a very wide coalition. One way of describing it is a coalition that extends from Liz Cheney to AOC. It's going to make a lot of us uncomfortable about our policy preferences in the short term. There will be very strong disagreements, but those disagreements will not be settled democratically unless we first preserve our democracy. And so I think there is a growing realization of that amongst some elites. Focusing in specifically on religious conservatives, I named some of the folks who I think have been out there telling the truth about what's happening for a while. Again, David French, Peter Wenner. One book I can highly recommend that recently came out is by the Atlantic journalist Tim Alberta, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which includes a tremendous amount of on-the-ground reporting. He himself is a very devout conservative evangelical son of an evangelical pastor. You might not agree, you probably won't agree with the kind of political theology that he outlined in the third part of his book. But the first two parts of the book really kind of fill in a sort of rich and nuanced and first-person way the sort of more abstract sociological and historical analysis that Sam Perry and I and other scholars have been engaged in. And I would say, more broadly, that there is a lot of sort of ferment and even turmoil amongst conservative white Christians in the United States. And don't assume that these people, especially younger people, are unreachable and that you can't talk to them. This is not the case. There are going to be things that many folks, probably most folks in the room, will strongly disagree with them about. But I think most of them are fundamentally committed to kind of equality and freedom that are really sort of at the core of the American ideal insofar as we still share it.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Mark Andreevich from Monash University. You proposed several paradoxes that I think are really interesting, and the secularization of Christian nationalism, I think, is a really interesting one. And I was thinking about the way in which it's becoming political of a religious identity. And I suppose the converse is also true. It's becoming religious of a political identity. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to dig deeper into what you think some of the conditions contributing to that logic of secularization, declining church-going, but more vociferous evangelical identification simultaneously. I'm just curious what you think structures that or makes that possible.
Sure. So let me just point to, I think, a couple of the deeper and less often remarked causes. So there is, of course, the kind of death and race between the Republican Party and that evangelical leadership, right? That's sort of the more obvious part. But there's some other less obvious things that are going on. One is I think people tend to underestimate the significance of the decline of liberal Protestantism. If you go back to mid-20th century United States, the leading figures, the people who define publicly what American Christianity was not Ralph Reed, it was Reinhold Niebuhr, right? And importantly, they were engaged in a critical dialogue with evangelical Christians on their own terms, using their own language. Who's left to do that to? where are our Reinhold Beavers? I mean, the only group that I see that is still capable of engaging conservative evangelicals on their own terrain that way is actually the Black Church. As we did, the Black Church, but sort of Black Church. So, people like William Barber, Reverend William Barber, proud to say, just recently moved to the Yale University. I think another change that's less often remarked that's really important is the shift from smaller denominational congregations to large non-denominational megachurches. Now, why would that be? For two reasons. One is that these churches are centered around a single charismatic pastor, right? Who doesn't owe anything to anybody, who does not have peers or colleagues who can call him or her to account, but is at the same time beholden to powerful people within his or her congregation, let's say people who can write checks. And who typically also has a kind of a celebrity persona, which leads them to try to make connections with people in business, politics, and so on. And so if you sort of contrast those two situations, you have, a pastor of a church with 200 people, who's part of some Baptist correspondence, meets colleagues from around the region, as part of a denominational hierarchy, was trained at a denominational seminary. You compare that to the dude in the Hawaiian shirt, who, decided at age 40 that he was called to be a pastor. And, managed to build up a congregation of 2,000 people, 4,000 people, right? And, had political ambitions, and, also, let's just say it out loud, financial ambition. And connected with that is the shift. I think this is also unremarked. It's a shift from democratic to spectatorial culture within these congregations. So Tocqueville famously in Democracy in America talked about church voluntary associations being schools for democracy, and talked about churches in particular as being schools for democracy, where the laity was involved in governing, where there were open discussions and debates. There's none of that in these big mega churches. Zero. You go there like you go to the movies or you go to a rock concert to sit in a comfy chair, take in the show, and see the guy up on the stage with the fancy mic on, putting on an incredible show, pacing back and forth across the stage and giving you some kind of an emotional high. Any kind of real form of discipleship. So I think that's another really important thing that's sort of often unremarked about how it is that this sort of shift could take place. I'm going on long. I'm gonna say one last thing, which is that I think it's also important to understand that, and especially the sort of media and cultural audience, I think you probably know this and you'll definitely get this, that the deep story of white Christian nationalism, not just temporally deep, it's also culturally deep. That is, it is seeped out into the secular popular culture, and it's applied some of its most powerful myths and tropes. So one example, think about the sort of post-apocalyptic novel or movie. One of the most popular genres out there. Where did that come from? Why does that appeal to people? You don't have to ever darken the door of some, fire and brimstone preaching evangelical church to be familiar with this catastrophizing apocalyptic narrative and to resonate with a politician who echoes that back to you the way that you.
Thank you, Dr. Gorski, for this talk. I want to pick up on the idea of Black church leaders. And if I'm not mistaken, on the apostle slide, the top right was T.D. Jakes.
Yep.
So my question is this: You had spoken about the possible kind of whitening of Latino populations and kind of away from Catholicism. Do you see his popularity in terms of his prosperity gospel, and do you see a kind of de-whitening going on? And how is that figure of T.D. Jakes assimilated as a Black church leader? And then the second question is, if I'm not mistaken, his daughter recently took over that church. And do you have a sense of what the future of that kind of broader movement within, of course, he goes beyond just the kind of Black congregation, but do you have a sense of where that might take us? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think, my brief discussion of the religious realignment really was very much focused on white Christianity, just because of the topic of the talk. But of course, something very similar is happening amongst Black Christians and African Americans more generally. So, I'm sure most of you know that the story about younger age cohorts drifting away from organized Christianity, that story holds a fortiori for young African Americans, right? And it is also the case that Pentecostal and prosperity gospel churches are growing at a much more rapid clip than sort of old line kind of AME Baptist churches, which is really sort of, really, since before the Civil War, defined what Black Christianity meant. And so absolutely, you're seeing a kind of a similar sea change. I want to just put an asterisk after my use of the term secularization, because I use this reluctantly and very advisedly, because I don't think it really captures our political moment. I think the rise, much less our cultural moment, I think the rise of Pentecostalism and prosperity gospel perfectly illustrates. What we are seeing, the way I would put this, is a return to immanence, not merely the disappearance of transcendence, or put it in more cultural terms, return to magical thinking. Prosperity gospel is a perfect example of this kind of magical thinking, but it's incredibly pervasive. It comes in all sorts of non-Christian forms. And so, sure, there are spaces where Christianity is given way to scientific materialism. There are the little dots called university campuses, but much outside those confines, this is simply not what you find. I think we do have to reckon with this, what this means for, the possibility of rational dialogue and democratic politics.
Thank you for the talk, Phil. And you had two data points that stuck out to me, and you've spoken about them already in this Q&A session. But so we see the decline of Christianity in one sense, with church attendance and people identifying as nuns. At the same time, this white Christian nationalist movement is being propelled by figures who identify as evangelical, but not necessarily Christian or church attending. I'm wondering if what the connection could be between the two. Do the people who call themselves evangelical but might not actually be Christian, do they feel the same anxiety over the decline of Christianity, for example?
Well, of course, the answers could be yes and no, right? So, if you survey these folks, that is, the folks who were not really churchgoers, couldn't quote a single Bible verse to you, etc. But who still call themselves evangelicals. They don't really care about abortion. They don't really care that much about gay marriage. Maybe transgenderism, bothers them, but the things they really care about are immigration and foreign policy. They're kind of really America first and the kind of original proto-fascist fence from the mid-20th century, right? But of course, it's precisely because evangelicalism has been so co-opted by political conservatism, that there's very little friction or tension between them, that makes this kind of identification possible. And I guess the last thing I would say is, it's much more palatable to say that you're defending Judeo-Christian civilization than to say that you are defending white supremacy. And I don't think we should underestimate that. I think this is a cynical tactic amongst avowed white supremacists, but I think it is also a sort of unconscious defense mechanism amongst other folks who may harbor deep racial prejudices that they don't want to admit to others and might not even want to admit to themselves.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm Dr. Valaskivi from University of Helsinki, and I work on religion and media, populism, nationalism, and AI. My question is about the transnational white Christian nationalism and movements also in the United States that are kind of consciously and purposefully kind of networking around the world, including the Russian ultra-Orthodox oligarchs and different types of organizations and kind of lobbying bodies that they fund in Europe. The ADF International, Citizen Go, others like that. Would you like to say something about that?
Well, first, let me just say that we're very much on the same page about the research that needs to be done. That there is a lot of specialized knowledge out there in regional silos and disciplinary silos, and it's really imperative that folks start getting outside of those silos and trying to understand these connections because they clearly do exist. International religious nationalism may sound like an oxymoron, but it's not. Any more than a fascist international was an oxymoron in the mid 20th century. I learned from, I think David is here, David Martin, colleague in sociology here last night, that at the Argentinian president's inauguration, who was there? Orban was there. What was there?
Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro was there, right? I think a bunch of these guys were there. I mean, it's very clear, as if we, from that, if it wasn't already, that these folks are networking with each other, that they're learning from each other, that they're imitating each other. So David told me that one of his first moves was to just issue this barrage of executive orders, exactly the way that Trump did, to kind of shock the system, to throw opponents into disarray, basically set the agenda, right? So this is, borrowing even at the level of these kinds of tactics, and we of course know about, the copycat insurrection following Bolsonaro's electoral defeat in Brazil, and it's one of the reasons I really am excited about this conference is I think this will begin to connect people and synthesize some of this knowledge. So would love to talk with you more at some point, about collaborating to make this happen, because I think it's crucial right now at the moment.
Bill, thank you very much. It was superb, and I've learned a great deal from it. What at the center of our being together here is at this conference is the question of media, and I wanted to raise media for a moment because it strikes me that quite a number of the contradictions and that you've been talking about, the incommensurabilities between the way things traditionally were constituted are in a way explained by media. That I think what we're experiencing is sort of the later effects of a decades-long transition of religion out of institutions and into the public sphere, enabled by its fusion with modern systems and arrangements and relations in media and circulation and mediation, things about the way charisma is carried out today. All of those things are defined by the public kind of marketplace commodifications that are so functional. And we've had this going on since the rise of televangelism, which I think was one of the major reasons that we noticed the new evangelical revival in the 1970s was the emergence of these major figures, Falwell and others. And so that you have, and I think there are other kinds of elements to the magical thinking that you were talking about. I mean, that's something that the media imaginaries are all about imagination and all about and the conditions of the systems whereby those things are made rational or rationalized or thought about, codified, or it's entirely new terms of debate because of the way we live in a kind of media environment. So the media are very much involved in. And again, what Katya's point about the internationalization of this, the fact that these systems can circulate, the rhetorics can circulate. You hear terminology, and I was in Australia in the spring, and I was amazed at the extent to which Australian resistance movements were using American terminology because they have access to it through these systems. And it seems to me that there's this kind of systematic layer within which all of this is functioning, which helps explain what in more grounded institutional, traditional power terms, et cetera, political terms, might seem so contradictory. We can understand that they can exist at that level because of this institutionalized system of circulation and mediation.
Yeah.
One final point. I just wanted to, on your point about the decline of the main line, and I think this is probably significant to the larger question. David Hollinger argues that the reason the main line declined was that it won. That is, that it came to define moral culture, and so the mainline leaders sort of said, well, there's not much more work for us to do. We'll go off and, get into therapeutic culture or something instead. So.
Well, they won a battle. It's not clear yet whether they won a war. David and I actually just traded emails this morning about this fact. So, but yeah, I mean, to your point, I think there are lots of people here in the room who are better qualified to do this sort of analysis than I am. But let me just give you two real hot takes. So I think, one could almost say that there has been a shift in American Christianity from the word to the image. Yeah, so, again, think about, back in the days of the Frozen Chosen, where, the pastor would stand up and talk for a half an hour and, this imageless, and now the jumbotrons and the praise music and, all the theatrics, right? That really define what worship is. And I think, media folks know much better than I that images work much differently than words. And this is, of course, not something that's going on in churches. It's going on much more broadly. I think, all of us who are teachers know that our kids don't read as much, can't read as much, won't read as much, get most of their news, their information from image, video and other kinds of image sources, and it's just the epistemology that is really different. And the second thing, I happen to be rereading Walter Ong's famous book on oral and literary cultures, and there is a sense, I think, in which we are again in this regard returning to a more oral culture, in the sense that that's really what memes viruses are, right? They are like those sort of common sense phrases that were sort of repeated and gained their power from repetition in oral culture. At least as Ong analyzed and understood them. And I think this again is one of these things that we're only beginning to grapple with and are thinking about democracy, because discourse ethics, discursive democracy, like how does that work when we live in a culture, a public sphere that's just completely flooded with memes and images instead of with words and arguments.
One very quick
questions from Ramesh, I think it's where.
Oh, sure, I'll be really quick. So there's two parts, but I'll be really quick. Okay, so, so that was so insightful how, you were able to sort of help me at least understand how there's the conflation of these multiple sort of identities that are part of this. But I think also so much of this from like replacement theory to the operations of people like Steve Bannon working intentionally across different parts of the world, have a certain kind of structural, there's a structural component to all of this, right? So I'm curious about, you know, how you perceive someone like sort of a political operative like a Steve Bannon amidst all of this. Maybe him in particular, but more generally, I know he loves the attention. That's sort of one question. And then the other was, you know, what is, you know, you described the kind of multiracial democracy as the alternative vision. You know, we had that opportunity, we had kind of perhaps something that was more like apple to apple in the 2016, not 2016, excuse me, in the 2016 election with the alternative of a populist in Senator Sanders, who was phased out. So I wonder how much of all of this is sort of an affective reaction to a feeling, you know, a false sense of being dispossessed, you know, and the absence of an apple to apple alternative. You know, we had Hillary Clinton, who was perceived as, you know, part of the neoliberal hypocrisy, right? Which, and then we had this populist affect in Trump. So I guess that I'm just sort of puzzling this together.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, so we have the world's leading expert on Steve Bannon sitting in the back of the room, Ben Teitelbaum. So I'm gonna like punt that question to the back of the room for him to pick up on. You spent what, like 80 hours talking to him or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, so he knows from Steve Bannon, so I'm not even gonna try. But I think, you know, what you're raising is to some degree also a question of kind of political strategy. So that if the fundamental challenge of democratic politics, you know, throughout the world pretty much today, has to do with navigating the tension between deep cultural diversity and democratic solidarity. Not unity, that's impossible. But, you know, enough solidarity amongst people in the broad middle to sustain civic dialogue and democratic institutions. How do you do that? And I think it's a very thorny ethical and political question. So, you know, one answer is, let's talk about class, or let's talk about national identity, and let's stop talking about race, gender, ethnicity. And then there's the other alternative. Well, you can't do that because, you know, intersectionality, etc. Right? And I don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's a very urgent one and a very hard one. And I hope people who are smarter than me and more politically savvy are that is that question.
All right, unfortunately, we're out of time. I would like to thank Phil Gorski for starting us off. Such a and I just wanted to remind everyone that we have another plenary today at 4 in the same room with Dr. Rakishan on Hindu nationalism and gender, and that also promises to be a wonderful plenary. I hope you can join us. Thank you again for coming. There are more refreshments outside, and please, I know that there are people who had questions, please come to the podium. It's up to Bill. And thank you again.